Welcome to the first episode of this new channel, Reformation Brotherhood. My name is John William Noble, and I will be hosting this time that we are spending with a very special guest who doesn't need much introduction, Pastor Douglas Wilson from Christ Church in Moscow, Idaho. And we are dealing with the latest internet controversy, which seems to be of a regular occurrence at this point in time, dealing with the subject of Abigail, Nabal, and the red dress. And to help us begin to get our teeth into this subject, we're going to play a short clip from the end of No Quarter November, in which Pastor Wilson was speaking with his children, and this was what was discussed.
What would you say to a woman who's married to a man who is going this way? Because it's something that I know of more than one circumstance of a woman who seems to be walking with the Lord, seems to be trying to do her duty, and her husband is going off the deep end. What is the...
I've said a number of times over the years, and this would be another occasion to say it again, is that in a world where some men can go the Nabal route, I have wished for more Abigails.
How, I guess what I'm trying to say is, how would you tell a woman to be an Abigail?
I would say, tell them to say to their husband, honey, wherever you're going, I'm not. Okay? I'm not going there. And if you don't stop going there, I'm setting up a flare. We're talking to the elders. We're not going to go off silently, sadly, into the night.
So if we can begin with just a brief explanation, if you can perhaps give a quick explanation regarding what the subject matter of 2 Samuel 25 is dealing with between Abigail and Nabal, and what has then transpired from the communication that you had on that episode. That would be a great way for us to begin.
Sure. In Samuel, what happens is David is on the run from the persecution of King Saul, the jealousy of King Saul, and he's out in the countryside with an armed band of men, and he wound up being an impromptu security force for the flocks of sheep and goats belonging to a man named Nabal. And Nabal is introduced as a churlish, wicked, hard-headed, hard-hearted man. And David sends an envoy of men at the time of shearing to ask for a gift in exchange for the services that they rendered in protecting his flocks and everything. Nabal backhands them, basically verbally upbraids them and sends them off. And David loses his temper and is about to go down and slaughter Nabal and every male in Nabal's household. Nabal had a beautiful and intelligent wife, we are told, named Abigail. She hears of this, and without consulting her husband, she packs up a bunch of provisions as a gift to David and meets him on the way and averts the disaster by her shrewd insight and her gift. And in that action that she took, she saved two men. She saved a worthless husband from being slaughtered, and she saved David, the future king, from incurring blood guilt before he came to the throne. And Abigail, in her speech to David, is very aware that David is going to come to the throne. She's very aware of that, and she wants to preserve his integrity, which she successfully does. But she does this without consulting her husband, and by going against what her husband had said. And her husband was acting like a king, had a big feast, and was drunk. And it's quite interesting that as a drunken king, he's acting as a type of the king that David is going to replace. David is going to replace Nabal because he winds up marrying Abigail, and he's going to replace King Saul as well. So there's a foreshadowing there. So I have over many years, I have wished that more Christian wives who were in grim and dire situations would be willing to play the role of an Abigail, to draw the line and say, no, this is not appropriate. And I've emphasized this because in our ministry, we have emphasized very strongly the biblical teaching on headship and submission in marriage. The husband is the head of his wife. I believe that the marriage vows ought to include the vow from the bride to obey her husband. That's what the Bible requires of women in Titus. So we teach headship and submission in marriage. We teach that the husband has true authority, and the wife is to obey that authority in true submission. But we also teach that we're a fallen race. This is a fallen world, and no human authority can be considered absolute. The civil magistrate has true authority, but not absolute authority. The pastor and elders have true authority, but not absolute authority. And the husband in the home has true authority, but not absolute authority. So that's the setup. In the conversation with my kids, my daughter Rachel asked me, "What do you do in a situation when a husband is going around the bend?" And she was talking off the deep end, I think is what she said. A husband is going off the deep end, and the topic had been anti-Semitism and that sort of thing. What do you do if what should a wife do if a husband's going off the deep end? And I referred to the Abigail situation, interpreting that so the husband is being a Nabal. And what that meant, that set the context of the husband is being really, really bad. Really, really, really bad. Not room for interpretation. Not a difference between husband and wife over whether they ought to have Mexican or Chinese food at the restaurant they go to, but he's being objectively, truly bad. And so I said that I wished more Christian women would play the part of Abigail in those situations and call the elders if their husband is getting drunk and muttering dark threats against the Jews and doing all kinds of stuff. A godly wife ought to send up a flare and say, "This household needs pastoral help." That was what was said, and controversy ensued. And so one of the things that was my words were interpreted as saying, I think that wives ought to bust their husbands for being a little bit right wing or being too right wing. This would be difficult for me to do because I'm pretty much the most right wing person I know. Why would I do that? So the issue is not right wing or left wing or position on the spectrum at all. I would give the same advice to a wife whose husband was wanting to trans kids and doing the rainbow thing. I would say the wife ought to tell the elders, we need help over here. And I think someone could be a Nabal somewhere politically in the middle of the road, but he could be just violating God's basic laws, the Ten Commandments stuff. So it's not really a political issue. It was simply the grist for the mill in that illustration happened to be political. And for us, this is not a hypothetical situation. We've had to deal with this sort of thing pastorally before. I wasn't making up an example to suit myself. This is something that I have pastor friends who are having to deal with the same kind of toxic attitudes in their churches.
This is actually something that I noted in your recent blog. So I'm aware of time. Could you give one example of where you have dealt with this Abigail type situation in application previously? Because you've established this has been the historical position of your church. And so this would be something to help people to realize that, no, this isn't that Moscow are going woke, as some people have ridiculously suggested. So could you maybe give just one example so that our listeners are aware, no, this has been the consistent position?
This has been the consistent position of the church. And I will make up a representative example, but this is based on real life. Let's say a wife has a husband who has a real temper. He explodes at her. He explodes at the kids. He doesn't seek forgiveness afterwards. There's no restoration. It's like a walking on eggs situation all the time. And when he loses his temper, he says all sorts of toxic and vile things. So we're not talking about him being mildly annoyed that the dinner was late. We're talking about the husband is on a hair trigger, and let's say the wife comes to me and says, our whole household walks in fear. We don't know what to do. We can assure you that our family needs help. Okay. And there have been times when a wife has come to me, and sometimes, and I'll ask, does your husband know you're coming to me? And sometimes she says, yes, he does, and he's for it. Or yes, he does, and he didn't stop me. Or, it could be a whole range of things. Or it could be, no, he doesn't know because I don't know how to bring it up without setting off a conflagration. So, but we need pastoral help. And she sought that pastoral help without her husband's permission. And so in a situation like that, I would then contact the husband and say, I don't want your wife to catch it because of this, but I need to talk to you. And we'd pursue it pastorally. And sometimes that all sorts of other issues could get swept up in the attitudinal problems. It could be financial issues, household finances. It could be politics. It could be the Jews. It could be Antifa.
Okay, that's helpful in terms of establishing the consistent grounds. So what is it you think that has caused the great controversy? Because one of the main things that seems to have sparked this has been a tweet that was released by Eric Kahn, and many people have jumped on this. So do you think the issue is with regards to what they believe or have interpreted your views on subjects like biblical patriarchy, or is it more that they've interpreted it that you are communicating that they are Nabals themselves? I mean, where do you think that the issue has come?
Yeah, so I think they might be worried that I'm saying that they are Nabals, but which I'm not. What I'm saying is that they have a higher tolerance for Nabals than I do. Okay, so
yeah.
And this is one of the things that makes laboring for the unity of the Spirit and the bond of peace a challenge, because let me illustrate this with another example. Tim Keller, for example, before he went to glory, Tim Keller at the end of the day would affirm a biblical position on homosexuality. Okay, he would say something like, homosexual behavior is not consistent with God's plan for human flourishing. Okay, and I would say something like, sodomy is evil. Well, you might be able to tease out identical content from both of those statements, but there is a vast difference in how gingerly something is addressed. And when we have dealt with extreme right-wing positions, and I mean toxic extreme right-wing positions, we have had very little tolerance for that. That's got to know that you can't do that. You can't do that here. In other parts of this controversy, there has been more of a desire to bring guys like that along, right? So just as and they would say something like, we don't agree with that, we don't hold to that, we're not Nazis, we're not anti-Semitic, but we see why these guys feel the way they do, and we want to extend a helping hand, and we want to bring them along, right? And if you preach your anti-neo-Nazi sermon, then guys who are being affected by them will not come to church. They'll drift away. They'll fall away from the church, and that'll be sad. Well, I would point out that that's exactly how Tim Keller approached the homosexual thing. He held to the biblical position, but he said, if I thundered an anti-sodomy sermon, if I just came off the top ropes, then there are a lot of young men in Manhattan who are struggling with this issue, they would just write me off and they wouldn't come to church. And I feel for them. I want to reach them. I want to bring them to a more biblical position, but it's being done in a much more soft way than I think is appropriate.
Mm.
So there's certain, the Bible says that love covers a multitude of sins, and there are certain failings and human faults that you are supposed to be tender with, right? You're supposed to cover it in love and teach people and instruct them and bring them along. But there's certain things that they're sins that are, I would say, big E on the eye chart sins. And those sorts of things, you just can't give a foothold. You can't give a foothold to those in the church. The Bible, because the Apostle Paul teaches that certain sins are like gangrene. Okay, they spread in a virulent kind of way, and you have to have zero tolerance for them. Other sins, let's say you've got a dad in the church who brags a little bit too much about his days as a high school quarterback. Right? And you think you've been at a few dinner parties with him, and you think, I think he's and you come to the pastoral conclusion that he's maybe vain and maybe a little conceited about it. Okay, do you disrupt the unity of the church by going to war over that and calling him out by name in your next sermon? Well, no, of course not. There are categories of sins that you're supposed to be patient with and bring along and teach and admonish and correct. There are sins in those categories, but the Bible also teaches that there are certain errors that spread like gangrene, and the toxic attitude that I see on the right is encompassing some of that. It's some of that kind of sin. And if I'm in a debate with another doctor, that's the other doctor who wants to not treat the gangrene the same way I would. I'm not attacking him like he's gangrene, right? He's a doctor. He's a doctor with whom I have serious disagreements, and if he gets his way, the patient might lose a leg. So it's not a trifle, but I'm not accusing the people who have a different approach to eliminating this sin of representing that sin themselves.
So one of the issues is that a lot of the applications here, if this was in a local church context, then it would be easier to be clear in terms of where the congregation is at on some of these issues. Like there's been talk regarding neo-Nazism, white nationalism. But one of the problems is that some of the if you kind of like the ringleaders who themselves we would be considering as brothers in Christ, their actions seem to be pandering to a mob where some of them in their anonymous accounts on Twitter, there could be those who are even wolves in amongst them, things that are being communicated that would be utterly un-Christ-like and devoid of scripture. So do you think that it would be as far as to say that some of those with the greatest influences over them should be more specific in calling out and being clear on what shouldn't be being said and done? Because obviously the people are not pastors of the Twitter followers, but at the same time they have a great influence. I mean, how much of an influence do you think should therefore be applied with the things that are communicated by these leaders to their Twitter followers?
That's a great question. I do believe that public figures have a basic responsibility to anticipate certain basic common reactions, things that are going on in the wake of their teaching. Right? So I can't just say what I'm going to say and then plead the dictionary. Say, well, technically, if you parse what I say, this is the only thing I said, etc. And I'll give you an example from my own experience. I've written a couple of books on race relations in the United States, going back to the war between the states. All right. So one of the books was Black and Tan, which has a revisionist view of that war. Okay, so I don't accept the common received account of the causes of that war, the nature of that war, etc. So I talk about slavery, talk about the war between the states, and I have a admittedly revisionist approach to that. Now, and I'm saying it because I believe it to be true, and because I believe the Bible has a lot of express teaching on slavery, and I believe that we killed 600,000 people because we didn't tackle the social problem of slavery the way the Bible says to do it. So I did that, but I knew, and I continue to know, that if I do anything revisionist on the war between the states, there will be people who come out of the woodwork in support of me who are genuinely filled with ethnic animosity and hatred. I hesitate to use the term racism because it's been done to death, and I think that I think we're divided up into various ethnicities and tribes. I think there's only one race, the human race. So I don't like the word racism, but ethnic animosity, ethnic vainglory, ethnic all kinds. I know that if I write this way on the war between the states, I'm going to attract followers or fans or people who appreciate what I've said, who've got a real problem. The things that I'm accused of being a racist, which I'm not, some of my followers are actually going to be that. And I believe that I have a responsibility to anticipate that. It's a reasonable anticipation. And so I wrote another book called Skin and Blood. And Skin and Blood is an attack on all forms of kinism, all forms of ethnic vainglory. So what I did is, if people come out of the woodwork to join my cause, and they are bringing one of these toxic attitudes with them, I want to, first thing, disappoint them. I want to disappoint them. You can't be with me and have that attitude. So to move this over into the whole thing that we're talking about with right wing and anti-Semitism and Holocaust narratives and the post-World War II consensus, etc. If someone questions the narrative of World War II, my response to that is, be my guest. Right? If you want to write a book arguing that FDR knew about Pearl Harbor beforehand, then that's an open question. If you want to say that Churchill was wrong to argue for the firebombing of Dresden, I think that's a fair question. If a scholar, after much research, decides that Hitler didn't kill 6 million Jews, but he killed 5.7 million Jews, that's simply a math issue. those sorts of things. But if you're going to revisit those historical narratives, and I think in a free country, people should be free to revisit those historical narratives, you have to anticipate and you have to budget for the fact that you're going to get genuine anti-Semites under anon accounts up in the cheap seats applauding you. And the first thing in the world, the first thing you must do is disappoint them. You must disappoint them, because if you don't disappoint them, you're going to find yourself roped in with them, and they're going to become your representatives. And if you're not actually that way, and they've become your representatives because you didn't disappoint them, then it's your own darn fault. You did it to yourself. So I think that going back to my first example, if someone said, I don't know much about Wilson, but I heard he wrote a book that involves slavery, and I heard he might be a racist, something like that. If someone says that after 30 seconds of examination, I can understand why they would say that. But if someone actually looked some stuff up and spent half an hour looking at the things I've said and the things I've done expressly to disappoint the haters, they would say, oh, this is not that. This is not that. Now, this is being represented by some as Moscow going left, or Moscow going woke, or Moscow going wanting to appease the left somehow. No, this is one of the very first internet controversies I ever had was with the Kinists. I've been doing this for decades. This has been our position. We want to be Orthodox Christians. We want to represent what the Bible says, and we want to apologize for nothing in the Bible, right? And that's going to aggrieve and infuriate people on the left. But if we insist on being biblical about everything, it's going to disappoint some people on the right as well. And if that happens, that's the way it is.
Yeah, I think that's a really helpful, I mean, in some ways, exhortation and just explanation. And I suppose it leads into another kind of follow-up application that we've been seeing in recent days regarding what has been communicated about a husband's right to ask and almost demand a woman to wear a red dress every day if he so wishes. And with regards to that, it raises a number of questions in terms of what a man's authority, a husband's authority with his wife looks like. But just before we get to that specific example, do you think that this red dress example that's being given is an example of such men using their, if you like, internet followers and their demands and meeting it with a more extreme example, trying to show, well, look, we can give a proper patriarchal example that now even the likes of Pastor Wilson is not? I mean, do you think that that's been what's driven that type of example that's been being spread in the internet?
Yeah, so when you take extreme examples like that, the kind of thing that no sane husband would ever do, right? If you take an extreme example in order to say, and since there's nothing inherently immoral about wearing a red dress, if the husband said, I want you to wear this red dress, should a wife obey her husband? Yeah. I'd say, yeah, she should. And I would say, okay, are you willing for another extreme example? Right. All right. Are you willing for me to say, and let's say after a week and a half of wearing this red dress, the wife comes to realize that this is a function of her husband losing his mind, right? He's veering into a medical episode of some sort, and that's why he's doing and saying all these crazy things. John Knox, back in the debates over civil resistance, John Knox, who argued for the right of Christians to resist tyranny in the civil sphere, used the illustration of what would happen if a father, a head of a household, lost his mind and was going to burn the house down. And Knox, I said, suppose he had 5 sons, and let's say the 5 sons restrained him and sat on him. And Knox said, would these sons be doing what they were doing as rebellious sons or as dutiful sons? And the answer is obvious. They would be restraining a father who lost his mind as dutiful sons. Okay, now, if someone wants to, I don't mind extreme illustrations. I've used a number of them, but I do believe that you need to have balance in your extreme illustrations. So if someone said the red dress example, that's really extreme. Okay, yeah, there's nothing inherently immoral about this, okay, and I would say if I'm preaching a sermon, I would make a point of giving another extreme example in the other direction. Okay, so that people don't come to think that I'm on the husband's side no matter what. Right? Because to be always on the husband's side is to give way or capitulate a bit to identity politics, men against women. The idea that men are against women is absurd. That's a critical theory issue, right? Wise men and wise women are against foolish men and foolish women. So if someone always takes the part of the husband, no matter what, then they're what I call a masculinist. if someone always takes the side of the woman, no matter what the external facts are, then they're a feminist, right? If the woman says, and then my husband beat me and he raped me and he fat shamed me and he did all these things, and she has absolutely no evidence for any of this, just her assertion. There are women, and then men also, who are on her side as soon as she makes the accusation. That's feminism, because you're on the side of the woman who says it, because a woman says it. If you're on the side of a man, just because the man says it, then it's identity politics. What you want to do is say, okay, we've got this report. The pastor and elders have got this report. The Bible requires that we confirm everything with 2 and 3 witnesses. Can this be independently confirmed? If we confirm it independently and the evidence goes against the husband, we're on the side of the wife. If the evidence goes against the wife, if she's the abusive one, then we are on the side of the husband, right? Truth, falsehood, these are strange words, right? We live in subjectivist times. And so consequently, we have to realize that there's an objective world outside the feelings and outside the emotional controversy and the collision that people might have. And it's the job of pastors to come in, sort things out according to the facts. So now, at some point, let's say the wife has been wearing this. I'll just step into the extreme example, and say, let's say the wife is doing this, and because it's not inherently immoral, she is obeying, complying, and she's asked her husband, why are we doing this, and he won't tell her. At some point, I think it's legitimate for her to ask a pastor or an elder to ask her husband, what's going on? What's up? What are you doing? Okay. Now, and I also think it's appropriate for a pastor, if a man is consistently online bragging about what a dummy his wife is, she does whatever I say. If I tell her, and of course, a husband has authority in the home, and he should direct the home. But if he's bragging about how she cleans my boots every night before dinner, and does so on hands and knees, saying, yes, my Lord, and he's bragging about that on, please tell me what to think about the world, my Lord. If he's doing that on Facebook, one of our elders is going to call him up and say, what are you doing over there?
So there's been a few hypothetical examples that have been given using the red dress analogy. So let me just give one, just to give the listeners an idea of how you would respond to this. Let's say it was 2 or 3 years ago, and a husband was really worried about COVID, and he said to his wife, she must wear a mask at home, at church, at all times. And this is because it's a husband's authority. How would you, as the pastor of this couple, address that sort of situation? Because it's applying the same logic with the red dress.
Yes, it is. The difference would be, this is actually not a hypothetical. I've got a pastor friend in another city who had a situation almost exactly that way, and so requiring the husband, the family, to come to church in masks, and all sort of an ultimate fastidiousness about him. And the difference is, wearing a red dress is simply a statement. It's just a fashion thing. Wearing a mask is a health issue. It's you're wearing this little petri dish on your face all the time. It affects children's ability to learn. You're doing actual damage, right? So if a husband was requiring, masks are a good example. A related example would be, let's say the husband was freaked out about COVID and was requiring the family to get vaccines. Okay. Yeah. And let's say the wife was well read on it. She said, this is bad. This is bad. And she didn't want to get a vaccine. She didn't want the kids to get vaccinated against COVID. That's the sort of thing where I think the wife could and should send up a flare to the elders and say, we've got this situation where my husband wants us all to do something that I consider dangerous because of his fear. He's being driven by fear. Could we have a pastoral intervention before we get the vaccine? I would support a wife doing that. I would also support a wife asking for help on the mask issue, only perhaps not as quickly. The vaccine is either you do it or you don't do it. The mask, you might be cooperating with him for a few weeks, but when you see where it's going and what's driving it, it'd be fully appropriate for the wife to ask for help in a situation like that. I also think it's appropriate for the wife to ask for help on a ridiculous red dress scenario, but again, not as quickly. So I don't think that wives should be on a hair trigger. Hubby did something I disagree with. That's it. I'm calling the elders. Submission doesn't mean anything unless you're willing to go submit to things you don't agree with, right? If the husband said, honey, put on your best red dress, we're going out to dinner to your favorite restaurant, she wouldn't say, I submit. That's not a submission issue because she wants to do it. But if he wants her to do something she doesn't want to do, let's say change something up in the homeschool curriculum, and they've talked about it, they've not been able to come to agreement, he's not been a jerk, they've worked it through, but they still disagree, and he makes a decision, she should cheerfully implement his decision. She should obey him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really helpful. So with regards to when you're dealing with the Nabal situation in a family context, again, it's trying to decipher the distinction between what we're seeing of kind of internet involvement and local church involvement. Would you say that people who, for example, have these anonymous accounts and they're communicating things supporting, let's say, very extreme conservative positions, as they might call them, would you say that there needs to be, even for such men, an accountability that they have for what they're saying and communicating on the internet with their local churches? Because the anonymity that you have with so many of these people is that they're communicating things that are so extreme and maybe even inconsistent with what they're communicating in their local churches, because this is probably part of the issue here in terms of these followers, that it's not so much necessarily what the people who have the big followers themselves are communicating, but as you've said, it's more the followers themselves and what they're then thinking of this. So with regards to avoiding the Nabal applications, I mean, how do you think this internet anonymity thing can be addressed, if at all?
Yeah, that's another great question. And here's a basic division. Let's say we were living in an oppressive, authoritarian, or totalitarian regime, which we are approaching. We've been given a reprieve in this regard here in the States, but a number of the Western democracies are, when you can get arrested for something you said on Facebook, or when you can get arrested for praying outside an abortion clinic silently, we are in tyranny territory, right? But let's say the tyranny is full blown. You're living in Soviet Russia, okay, or you're living in a woke nightmare, and you're writing against the regime anonymously, because if you signed your name, you'd be arrested 30 seconds later, and we'd never hear from you again. If you are writing, if you're writing the in woke, presenting arguments for why men are men and women are women, and why transing kids is sinful according to the Word of God, and it's just sober analysis of the issue, then you can be as anonymous as you need to be. Okay, political theory done anonymously, political speech done anonymously is an old and honored tradition. The Federalist Papers here in the United States were published under pseudonyms. So we now know that Alexander Hamilton and John Jay and James Madison wrote the Federalist Papers, but when they were first published, they were under pseudonyms. And I don't have any difficulty with that. What we're dealing with now on Twitter is personal attack. Okay, when someone is attacking, when an anon account, a crusader with laser eyes, is attacking the integrity of a minister that he's never met, and he's saying he's going woke, he is compromised, he's being paid by the Mossad, all of these scurrilous attacks, or just simply name calling, that kind of thing being done anonymously is simply wicked, and there's no justification for it. There's no excuse for it, and if a Christian has an anon account, let's say he has an anon account because he works for a corporation that has a woke HR department, and if his identity were known, he'd be fired. Okay, simply because he is arguing for certain positions, but he avoids scurrilous abuse of anybody, then that's good. If his criticism ever became personal, where he was critiquing another minister by name, then I believe that his minister should know who he was. Right?
Yeah,
so what he should do is he should go to his pastor and he should say, these are the circumstances. I'm not known to the general public because my job's at stake, but I found myself in a debate with this other minister across the country, and I want guardrails up for me. Would you please monitor this account for me? And if you see me crossing the line, let me know. He should be under authority for anything like that.
Yeah, I think that's really good and helpful counsel. And just to say, in relation to this, the things that I saw communicated about my friend Pastor Tobias from people who, by and large, have never known of him before the past couple of months, some of the memes that were produced, some of the comments that were made, that he's woke, he's liberal, and some other outright derogatory things are a classic example of where this is a minister of the gospel who has been verbally abused in ways that have shocked me in terms of someone who would be a professing Christian. But I think also this is where even what's been communicated over the past couple of weeks in a different way, but even more so in other regards, it's been shocking to see what some people have said directed towards you, given the fact that all of the people who have the large followings, almost all of them that I know of, have articulated just what a big influence you have had on their ministry. So this is the final question, because I'm conscious that we were running out of time. This is the final question I wanted to address. Has it surprised you that some of the people who have openly and continuously said how much they've learned from you and been blessed by your ministry, that it seems as though they are now in some ways almost turning against you or trying to take this to new extreme levels, and they seem to be willing to throw you under a metaphorical bus in the process? I mean, has this been surprising, or do you not think it's that bad?
I've been somewhat surprised, and much of it is with grief in their heart. I've learned so much from you, and it grieves me that you're now doing this, and it grieves me that someone who followed me for so long didn't hear what I was saying. Because when people with grief in their heart say that we're drifting left or we're going woke or we're doing anything like that, simply because we resist toxicity on the right. When they say that, we've been resisting toxicity on the right for many of these people from before they were born, right? So we haven't moved, we haven't budged. That we've got the same philosophy and theology of ministry. We've just stayed put, and the world has gone crazy around us. And so consequently, if anybody wanted to, they could. I started blogging in 2004, which has been 20 years, and it's all in the archives. You can look it up. You can do. I've got a search bar on my blog. Look up Kinnist. Look up anti-Semitism. Look at what I was saying in 2006 or 2013, and it's all the same thing. This is the same package. And if I wasn't woke then, I'm not woke now. All right. And if I'm woke now, then you were led out of wokeness by a woke guy. That doesn't make sense.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really helpful. And I think it also communicates something with regards to a younger generation of pastors, even if what they were communicating with regards to somebody going woke or somebody maybe being wrong in an issue, the way in which they have behaved and communicated towards you in this example, again, that in and of itself highlights a significant problem in terms of this whole trying to take things to the new extreme level. And this is certainly why it's very important to be addressing these sorts of issues, like the one that has been discussed regarding the Abigail response to the Nabals. So thank you so much for coming on today. This has been greatly helpful in terms of not just clarifying, but also in terms of providing further information and exhortations that I know many people within the church context in America and elsewhere would need to be hearing. So we're very grateful for your time.
Thank you so much. It was a privilege.